welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm a board member and I report for Le Monde and RFI. We are delighted to welcome you tonight and to watch together this documentary about two young men. At the time they were still young boys actually, who are and will shape Hong Kong's future one way or the other. I guess we could not hope to be more topical than having this movie tonight when Joshua started his hunger strike yesterday and the occupied trio have announced their intention to surrender tomorrow. I'm of the view that a society is as good or as bad as the youth it produces. In the case of Hong Kong, I must say, I'm very impressed being on the ground almost every day by the depth and the civic commitment you encounter when you meet randomly the young people who have been camping outside Parliament for the last 9 weeks. We're also delighted to have tonight Lee Ping Kong, who co-produced the movie. And I suggest, Lee, you just say a few words to introduce yourself.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ping Kong Lee. I met my director Matthew purely by chance. From that point on, I run into a very long series of witnessing people who perhaps have done more, gone so much more far up front than myself. Like Matthew, who just decided there's an important story to tell about Hong Kong that is relevant to the international community. And he just went out and did it out of his own saving and some limited support from a lot of people. And he is not even a Hong Konger. So I was amazed and I decided to join his team. Similarly, this film is about a bunch of very young people who just went out and did things that their other counterparts in society did not do, have not done. And they just went out and did it without asking too many questions. So I think that might be particularly meaningful tonight, given the current development of the events. Yeah. So I hope you enjoy the film, and I really appreciate you spend your time to pay attention and look at this part of, small part, but not unimportant part of history of Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you, Ping. And we'll also have Matthew Torne, who is the filmmaker, who will join us by Skype later. And we also have the pleasure of having some young members of Scholarism at the back of the room and other journalists, and I hope they will join the Q&A session. So I have no doubt we'll have fascinating sharing session afterwards. I guess while we are setting up the Skype conversation with Matthew, the director, we could already have some questions from the floor. And before anyone else, if you don't mind, I'd love to ask the members of Scholarism who are with us tonight their impression and possibly give them the first questions to the director if one of them or two of them don't mind to do so. Melody or one of your friends, can you share with us what you thought of the movie? What have you learned from it about your boss? It doesn't seem that easy. Your leader. Can a mic be given to the young lady? So this is Melody Chu from Scholarism. Thank you. Stand up if you want.
Hello, I'm Melody from Scholarism. And
What did you think of the movie? What have you learned from it?
This is actually the first time I've watched this movie, and I think it illustrates what has happened throughout the strike against national education, as well as
the recent event, I guess.
The recent event, and I appreciate that many international media are giving attention and helping us spread the news in Hong Kong to other countries. And we thank you for everyone's support.
Do you have any question for the director, or do you want that we start the Q&A? Anything surprise you about the movie?
Well, I think many of us did not have a really good
Knowledge
of what happened a few years ago, because most of us here were not members then. But I think this movie helped us realize and understand more of what has happened before.
Great. Thank you so much, Melody. So we're now in contact with Matthew Torne. Thank you, Matthew. I think you can hear us. And we also have Ping in the room. So I'm very happy to open the floor to whoever wants to start with the first question. I'm sure you do, but if not, I will start with the first question. I'd like to ask both of you, and possibly Matthew, what was it like to be with these two young men at the time, and how did you manage to keep a distance and not maybe espousing their cause, or how close and how close to their cause did you become over the time of filming, which has been a very long time and very intimate at some moments. I must say it's very moving sometimes when you see Joshua praying, for example, and crying. So can you share this aspect of your filming of these two young men?
Yeah. So became obviously to the subject. You spend this month with them. It was strange to be friendly with them. At the end of the day, filming or choosing people, I want to choose people who I get along with or I like, because it's a long time to spend with people you don't like. So, of course, the film is sympathetic to the students, the film is sympathetic to the young people. And I think this is important because so much of what has been written, both academically and in the media, about sort of democracy movement in Hong Kong over the last 30 years has been dominated by the older generation. And I felt that it was really important to give voice to this younger generation who, as we're now seeing, are kind of leading the way. But sort of 2.5 years ago, they were just emerging.
Did you see what's happening now coming?
Yeah, I think there was lots of signs that it was on the horizon. I've been following Hong Kong's politics very closely since 2003, and the current events, whilst no one could ever predict exactly how things were going to pan out, I thought it was, back in April I had predicted that Benny Tai and the official Occupy Central leadership would be usurped by students when the thing actually finally kicked off, because they didn't display any genuine resolve when the students, but the students on the other hand were clearly displayed genuine resolve. And I think it's one of the key sort of issues. I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to do this film, one of the things I think is still a key issue, is this sort of generational gap in the pro-democracy camp in Hong Kong. And still we see so much of the media focusing on the older generation, the key pan-democratic LegCo members. And okay, now people are focusing on what Alex Chow and Joshua Wong are saying as student leaders of this movement, but there's a wider issue, which is the generational disconnect between these two groups of people. So the older generation essentially they've been fighting for democracy because they wanted to preserve the rights and freedoms as of 1997. The problem with that argument is that essentially you have, they're making arguments about rule of law and, political science arguments, which, whilst are valid, aren't, they don't really carry currency with the man on the street in Sham Shui Po or Kun Tong, whereas the students are talking much more about livelihood issues and, the fact that Hong Kong is an incredibly unequal society and that this can be resolved through a democratically elected leader. Whilst it's no magic bullet, it does help to prevent maladministration. Yeah. So there's this quite big disconnect between the two groups within the pan-democratic camp, in that the older generation and the younger generation. I think that's very interesting, and if those who have paid attention to it over the last 5-6 years or so, I don't think anyone really was that surprised about what's currently happening.
That's right. So maybe Ping, do you want to comment a little bit on being close to these two people during the span of the filming? 2 years plus?
I would love to think of myself as in terms of age or the inside age, closer to them. But so often I realize, okay, my God, I'm old. They, not just in their taste in music, we're talking about different video games. When I mentioned Pac-Man or Atari, but anyhow, I digressed. They're much more ready to take action. They're much more ready to think of an issue as their own. Unlike my generation, unlike myself, even sometimes I verbally can say the same thing. I found myself hardly done as much as they did back then, and if you count everything they did from that point to now. Matthew just mentioned the generation gap, and I found that this was very insufficiently touched on in a lot of the international coverage of the event, because I'm sure you heard that not every Hong Konger is now on the street, right? You heard about the anti-occupying people, but I wonder if anyone went a bit further to look at the age profile. And what did they say? What their reasons are to actually go and to protest a protest, right? And you look at the age profile of people who are in the protest, and even within the protest, I'm sure you're aware that there's some, as in any large-scale protest, there are opposing ideas. They are perhaps fighting for leadership or distrust sometimes. Digressing strategy, but I urge you to look at the age groups. Like, who prefer Admiralty? Who prefer Mong Kok? Who made comments on Mong Kok? How old are those people? Who made comments about Admiralty? There's a wealth of understanding about Hong Kong there that I wish, it's probably too big a topic to go into detail right now, but I urge you to look further behind this, and this is 5 minutes away. You can find it.
Questions from the floor? Yes, over there. Thank you. Please introduce yourself briefly.
Gavin McDougall. Matthew, the exploration of the two characters within the film, Joshua and Ma Jai, we were just talking about the generation gap. It appeared to me that there was another gap, and it was between both of those boys, young men. And a lot of Ma Jai's thoughts were about his opinion about Joshua Wong and the approach he was taking. And I'd like your opinion. To me, it appeared to be more than anything else begrudging or almost reluctant respect for what Joshua was doing. There didn't seem to be the same exploration with Joshua about Marjai's approach and thoughts. Even though they didn't know each other, they knew of each other. You didn't seem to explore the other side. I guess that's a question in 2 points. A, the gap between the point of view between those two boys, and why did you not seem to explore Joshua's view of the other angle?
Okay, so I mean, essentially, Joshua's view, he sort of briefly outlines that he knows Marjai and that he became a legislative councillor and dropped out of school. And Joshua's view on this was very much guided by his keenness to appeal to a wide audience. So at the beginning of when I started working with him, he was, whilst quietly supportive of civil disobedience, his view was that he didn't want to get involved, he was under 18, and that essentially Marjai and his friends, whilst maybe were fighting for the right things, were actually not doing it in the best way, Joshua's view, in that the mainstream media was ostracizing them. They just weren't being covered, and so Marjai's fight was essentially being forgotten or marginalized or becoming made pointless. So Joshua had started this route where he began super moderate. When I started filming with him, he was meant to be the very moderate kid, and Marjai was meant to be the very radical kid. And Joshua, he designed all of the protests to ensure he carried public opinion with him. So even when they finally occupied the Legislative Council complex in September 2012, I mean, the decision to do that was done just, the night before. It wasn't, they were always testing the water of what they thought public opinion would accept, and then enacting it then. So their radicalism moved along. Their public radicalism moved along as they felt that the public accepted them. It's not necessarily that Joshua didn't agree with Marjai's methods, but he felt that without having the public behind you, those methods fell flat. So I think, Marjai, I don't think Marjai is that begrudging. I think what Marjai is basically saying is, everyone celebrates in the media Joshua Wong, and now they're obviously celebrating Alex Chow and a few of the other student leaders. Whilst those guys, it's not to detract from what those student leaders are doing, it then also suggests that, well, you cannot have any impact unless you are one of those 3 or 4 student leaders, and that's obviously not true. So I wanted to include Marjai because I wanted to show that there are lots of activists like him who are giving up an awful lot, in many ways giving up more than what Joshua has done, to do all of the sort of behind the scenes activism, which isn't glamorous, doesn't get you famous, but is absolutely required if you're going to make an impact. Because activism isn't, as what Marjai says at the very end, activism isn't just one big rally which 100,000 people turn up at. It's about keeping the ideas alive in people's minds for longer than just that 1 or 2 days when the event is happening. Because if it doesn't, then they don't maintain their vigilance towards erosion of their rights on a daily basis.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, the lady here in front.
Thank you. I'm Sherry Prasa from Bloomberg. I am interested in your decision to end the film where you did in light of recent events, and wondered if you've continued filming and if we'll be seeing at some point a sequel.
Yes, well, we decided to end where we did because I guess there's a point where you have to say, well, if I don't end now, when are we ever going to release this film? And when I first sort of set out to make the film, the idea had always been to film up until the Legislative Council elections. When we set out to make this film, we had no idea that national education was going to become such a big thing and that it was going to overshadow the Legislative Council elections as it did. Yes, we are continuing to film. I'm trying to put together something. We're working on a new project, obviously covering the Umbrella Revolution, but trying to cover something wider than just the Umbrella Revolution. I think, the Umbrella movement is just another manifestation, just like Article 23 in 2003 and anti-national education in 2012. It's just another manifestation of the conflict between Hong Kong values and being a Hong Konger and Chinese values as espoused by the Communist Party of China. So, what interests me is this conflict between of what does it mean to be a Hong Konger Chinese after 1997, when prior to 97, Chinese just meant ethnicity, whereas now it means nationality, and there is this, in addition to ethnicity, and there is this, it's very difficult to fight against the discourse coming out of Beijing, which is, that to be Chinese, you must be patriotic. You see it in the film where the old man accuses Joshua of not being Chinese. There's this idea coming out of Beijing all the time that if you don't do what they say, you're not patriotic or you're not Chinese. So I think that that's kind of what interests me more, about trying to look at the umbrella movement like that. And, obviously I'm not going to generate something as quickly as mainstream media, but then, my role is not to cover current events, but to try to put them in context and a longer term viewpoint. So maybe next year we'll have something done.
Thank you. Next question, yes, in the back of the room.
C.P. Ho, a former member of the board. What motivated you to do the film in the first place? Where did you get the idea?
Okay, so I had been studying. I had arrived in Hong Kong in 2003. I'd left Beijing with SARS struck in Beijing for Hong Kong, and I arrived, and the Article 23 protest, July 1st, 2003, happened just a couple of days after I arrived. And if that doesn't get you interested in Hong Kong politics, then I don't know what will. It was pretty striking compared to my experiences in Beijing the year before. And so I just ended up studying as much as I could about what's going on in Hong Kong, reading everything there was to read. And this ended up in doing a master's degree at Oxford on Hong Kong's post-97 political development. And at the end of the master's, it was a question of, do I do a PhD, maybe write something, because, Hong Kong is this very strange place. It has sort of the trappings of, it has the trappings of democratic things like elections, but with elections that don't really reflect public opinion. And this is what always interested me. But at the end of my master's, though, I had to make a decision. Do I want to, write a book or a master's thesis, which was going to sit on a library in Oxford, a shelf in a library in Oxford, just gathering dust, with only maybe a handful of people might have read? Or do I want to do a film which is, hopefully has more power to change in that, tonight, how many people have watched? Probably more than would ever have read a book that I might have written. So that was the reason for doing a film. And then, Hong Kong is this very strange paradox of a place. And I think that, not only is very misunderstood in the West, I think it's also misunderstood by many people in Hong Kong. The amount of people that I have met, Hong Kongers, who say, "Oh, but we have elections," but they haven't spent the time to understand how functional constituencies distort the election, and so on and so forth, which is understandable because obviously people are time strapped and there's an awful lot going on. It took a year of studying a master's degree to unpeel it all, and try to really get to it. So I hope that film will spur some people to take an interest a bit more, deeper, and to really understand what's going on in Hong Kong and how these elections are being perverted.
Great. Next question. Yes, the mic, please, in front.
Hi, Edith Terry, a former journalist. My question is, how and when did you decide to focus on Joshua Wong? It seems like from the chronology that when you started filming him, he was still relatively obscure. Now, to exaggerate a little bit, the anti-Occupy people see Joshua as essentially a CIA plant. They're not convinced at all that he could have done any of this on his own. And the celebration of Joshua, cover of Time magazine and so forth, just sort of feeds that paranoia. And personally, I feel that you've done I've seen more from your film about what an extraordinary young man he is than sitting here in Hong Kong reading the press. But that's the question. When did you, how did you fix on him?
Okay, so interestingly, I actually chose Marjai first because I'd spent some time with him. This was back in the summer of 2011, and he was, dynamic, getting himself arrested. It was exciting to film and exciting to watch back the rushes. And I thought to myself, wow, my original intention had been to sort of make a documentary, lots of talking heads of these sort of old guys like Martin Lee and Emily Lau and co. And I realized that actually the exciting story was really with the young people. And, film grammar, tells you that showing is more exciting than talking. So I picked Marjai because I knew that, well, he would do something. But I didn't know what. We were taking a gamble. And then one afternoon in August of 2011, I just witnessed Marjai get arrested, and I thought to myself, I don't want to sit outside North Point police station for 5 or 6 hours waiting for Marjai to get released. I've heard about this protest by this little group called Scholarism. I'll go along and see what that's about. And when I got there, it was decidedly uninteresting. There was just some of the usual faces there. They were singing Beyond songs, which is now, very popular, but it was pretty bad karaoke. And I didn't think this was very interesting. And it just seemed like national education was a little issue, which was kind of not all that interesting in the grand scheme of things. But I had nothing better to do, so I stuck around. And then at the end of this protest, this young 14-year-old boy takes the microphone and talks to the assembled media. And, God, he's so eloquent, and he speaks with so much power and passion. So I thought to myself, okay, maybe he's interesting. A couple of days later, I was at his house talking to his parents, and I realized that Joshua and Marjai had gone to the same schools, both had religious backgrounds, had grown up in the same South Horizons housing estate. So they seemed interesting, and they had these parallels. And I was also looking for moderate teenage activists to sort of counter my radical teenage activist. So that was how Joshua and I became acquainted. It was a Saturday afternoon in August 2011. And at the time he was 14. As for the CIA business, I mean, I think that it's just paranoia, really. I haven't seen any evidence of there being anyone else involved. Even his parents can't restrain him. You know, I'm just preparing DVD extras at the moment, and there's some nice scenes that we cut from the film where his mum and dad sort of say, maybe you shouldn't go to this protest, and he's like, I'm going. And I don't think there's anyone controlling him. I think he's a child with firm convictions and parents who, whilst are concerned, are supportive. And I think that's, you know, he has a special gift, which is he's a very good orator. You know, there's no, I've never seen any evidence of CIA or MI6. You know, I've been accused of being his handler, which was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, because if that was the case, well, I would have stayed in the Mandarin Oriental when I was making the film. So I've never seen any evidence of this. I think it's remarkable how, you know, 3 or 4 boys who were 16 to 18 came together and were able to, you know, really creatively think, how can we do something? And that was really the power of Facebook, because it was Facebook that connected them. And I think if it hadn't have been for Facebook, then they would have, you know, existed in their own schools but not joined up. So that's the power of social media.
Thank you. Next question? Maybe from the Scholarism student? No? You don't have question for Matthew? No? Yes? Okay, in front. Thank you.
Jessica Young. I'm actually interested in the comparison between Ma Zai and Wang Zifeng as well, because I'm also I'm surprised at the director's clarification on 2 things. One is that he actually sees Ma Zai as the radical activist and Wang Zifeng as the moderate. But then I don't know whether it is the film itself is conscious of it, because the depiction of Wang Zifeng and the depiction of Ma Zai in this film is very different. The depiction of Ma Zai is full of figurations of him, the way he moves around his mentors, and the background of his mentors and that political alliances is decidedly Trotskyian. They care about June 4th. Wang Zifeng also care about June 4th. But then they approach June 4th obviously in very different directions. It seems to me that the Ma Zai's alliance, they are in a way more traditional in terms of activism. But then Wang Zifeng's activism and his friends, they come from a very new direction, a very new angle, and a very new approach. And that is one thing. The other thing is a previous comment that the previous discussion on the comparison of the 2 young men focusing on the approaches. But then it seems to me that at least as depicted in the film, the difference between them is not only on the approaches, but on the issues they care about and the issues they start from. The Ma Zai and the Trotskyian mentors, they seem to be working on larger issues, broader issues about China and more abstract idea of justice. But then Wang Zifeng and his friends, they start from very local issues, which is very much a part of Hong Kong's localism, which is turning our world upside down now. So in a way, the difference is not so much in the approaches, but also in the content and in the concerns. That's why I'm surprised that the previous discussion has focused on the approach. I don't know whether my observations are conscious in the film, or the producer and the director object to my observation of the film altogether.
So maybe Pink can start.
Sure. And I'll leave the second part to Matthew about whether there's, you know, a conscious decision how you chose to depict the 2 kids. But on the radical thing, I think you're quite right. A lot of time, when politicians or activists were described as radical or not, is a very interesting bag of concepts in Hong Kong. As long as you shout louder, and back in 2011 or 12, if you pushed a barricade, if you dare to stand in front of the police to be sprayed by pepper spray, you're considered radical, right? And as Matthew pointed out earlier, Joshua, we found him quite conscious. I don't know, like conscious in the sense of he wrote down points and planned it, or just is his talent, that he paid attention to how much of the public he can bring along. And he's very well aware of how moderate, or some would say conservative, in terms of activism, people can take in Hong Kong. And also this is fluid. I don't know if you caught that in the first half of the film, Joshua mentioned that I'm not going to the liaison office of CCP because protesting there without the police letter of agreement is a civil disobedience, and we don't want to do that. In the latter half of the film, he himself was leading one of those protests. When Marzai, interestingly, he has a lot of ideas about, well, charging to police is no big deal because at that point, I see him as a machine. On the other hand, he also very happily did play the game of the political structure and help his mentor to run in the election. So it's also a fluid thing. But personally, some of my personal obsession is that having lived in different countries, I found the idea of who's radical is very, very strange in Hong Kong. So in a lot of the Q&As, discussion session after the screening, we talked to the audience. We got a lot of interesting response. When we test screen the film, most Westerners, British, Americans, it's mixed views on the two kids. But Hong Kong people who sort of very early on, maybe we picked the wrong test screeners. We deliberately picked people different from ourselves. Most of them don't like Marzai because he's too radical. We suspect it has something to do with rock music. We suspect cigarette stubbed out under the sole of the slipper, long hairstyle. I'm going to disclose something without his permission. When we follow the anti-national education, gradually you see the rock band start joining and play music in the occupying site. And the parents concerned group, we heard comments from individual parents questioning, why are there rock bands here? They dress in black, long hair, and they got earrings. This is a decent protest. This is a serious matter. Why do we get loud banging music? So that's the sort of idea of decency, legitimacy, what's proper, even when you are doing social activism. So this is why we would approach the description using the terms radical, not radical. And was that a conscious decision, how the two kids were depicted as such in the film? Matthew?
Well, when I picked them, it was a conscious decision that Marzai appeared radical, as we say in Hong Kong, and that Joshua appeared as moderate. But, over the course of the filming, those definitions are confronted because, Joshua, he doesn't, he becomes obviously more radical. Marzai becomes more and more moderate. I mean, he actually participates in the election, which is operating within the existing political system, which is, very moderate to my mind. And Joshua obviously becomes quite radical because he chooses not to participate in elections, but rather sees that the way to actually make an impact is to get people on the street. But I do think that this whole phrase of radicalism just needs to be confronted in Hong Kong because it is just toxic the way it's absolutely suppresses debate about what are legitimate forms of protest and legitimate ways of trying to change the system for the better. It's really, it's just not radical at all, and yet people get very upset about so-called radicals doing things. I find it laughable, really.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of the evening, and I can't resist but asking you about the current events, obviously, that you surely have been following very closely. What do you make of the option? I don't dare to use radical anymore now after what you said, but people do think that Joshua, for example, staying on, starting a hunger strike is a bit radical, and they may have lost their chance to come out of this with flying honors, etc. Are you confident they know what they're doing and they will come out of it the best, or what's your impression of all this, knowing them from back 3 or 4 years ago?
Well, I think, if they do what Anson Chan and others like Benny Tai would like them to do, which is all go home, say, didn't we have a fun time? What would they have achieved? Nothing. Hong Kong government has not budged an inch. So, of course, one has to escalate the action to try to have some kind of leverage. At the moment, all they want is just to open a dialogue again. So I completely disagree with this concept of, oh, now they're being too radical and they should go home because people are losing patience with Occupy Central or Umbrella movement. These movements are difficult. They're not easy. They don't happen quickly. What it suggests to me is that people who are calling for these people to go home, or the students to go home, these so-called Democrats, I would even ask whether they should call themselves Democrats, because look at movements around the world. I mean, did Martin Luther King go home when it got difficult? Did Nelson Mandela go home when it got difficult? Did Aung San Suu Kyi go home when it got difficult? No, of course not. So, one has to persist and one has to continue to fight. And I don't think that, again, it goes back to this generation gap. I think that at the end of the day, the older generation who are calling for the students to go home, even the ones who call themselves Democrats, the real problem is that they have too many vested interests in maintaining the current economic system. And so want to, don't want to bring the house down. I think the kids know what they're doing. And I think that when you're fighting for an ideal, you shouldn't be worrying all the time about public opinion, particularly public opinion that's dominated by Beijing-controlled newspapers. One should do what one believes is right and persist. So I think the students will, it's not going to be very easy. I don't suppose the government will do anything with Joshua now on a hunger strike. Realistically, I can't imagine them really taking any notice until he's admitted to hospital. And the reason for that is that too many moderate Democrats have gone on hunger strike in Hong Kong, but they go on hunger strike for 5 days. That's not a hunger strike. That's a diet, And if you're going to go on hunger strike and you actually want to make, for it to be successful, then the government has to believe that you are going to do it and you're going to stick with the course, until potentially death. And I don't know if Joshua has that resolve. I think maybe he does. Only time will tell. But I think that the government will take the gamble for at least the next 2 weeks that he doesn't. And I expect them to forcibly clear all the occupied camps within the next week or so.
Thank you very much. Shall we take one more question? Okay, one last question from the gentleman in the center here. Right here.
No, given what you just said, that it's obviously very concerning. If Joshua does have the resolve to go and pay the ultimate price, wouldn't a lot of people think that a leader of this drive, of this charisma, of this demonstrable ability to get people to support him, isn't he more, isn't his future in trying to push for democratic reform in Hong Kong, isn't he more valuable alive? I mean, what is your thought about, will people allow him to go to those extremes? I mean, wouldn't that be a tragic waste of his potential as a future leader of Hong Kong?
Yes, of course. It would be absolutely a tragic loss. And I hope that it doesn't go anywhere near that far, and that the Hong Kong government will see sense and at least begin genuine negotiations. But I think it's, my point about him having to go to hospital before the government will pay attention is really just to say that, for too long, too many people go on these fake hunger strikes, which have led the government to just be able to cry wolf. But I also think that whilst it would have been easier perhaps if somebody else had gone on hunger strike and Joshua had maintained his role as spokesperson, at the end of the day, he has to, to have that moral high ground to speak for the demonstrators, he has to also be willing to pay the ultimate price. And I think, it's the same with Aung San Suu Kyi. She could hardly have claimed to be the leader of the Burmese opposition and then allowed somebody else to risk their life in a hunger strike. So, whilst sad as it is, and one definitely hopes that it doesn't get that far, and that Joshua, that the government is willing to negotiate. I think, judging by how hunger strike has been abused in Hong Kong, and the government's intractability over the umbrella movement so far, it probably will take someone as high profile as Joshua, and for him to, really stick out the course for it to actually make any difference. I don't know whether he will do it, whether he will be able to or not. It's all fine and well, me saying this, but actually not having food, that's a whole different ball game. So I wish him well.
Well, someone is insisting for a very last question. So it will be a brief question and a
Matthew,
brief answer, please.
It's CP again. To put it in another way, what can the SAR government, or more importantly, the central government in Beijing, do if not lose face?
Yeah, I mean, losing faith, gosh, amazing what we'll do to avoid losing faith. I think there are things that can be done. I mean, there are even things that can be done whilst maintaining the August 31st judgment. The nominating committee the way it's composed can be revised. But essentially, the problem at the end of the day is that Chinese Communist Party will not allow anybody who is not loyal to them above all else to run Hong Kong or any other part of its territory. Having said that, I think that a more democratic, if not, it's never going to be democratic whilst the CCP is still in power, but a more democratic, the elected government would be able to resolve some of the problems that Hong Kong has, which is generating these protests in terms of the massive wealth disparity. And, I'm sure that if the Hong Kong government addressed livelihood issues properly, that much of the fury would be diminished. Ping is better to answer this question than me, but my view is that the Mongkok protests are a very different beast to the Admiralty protests. And the Admiralty protests are driven by middle-class kids with middle-class concerns for rule of law and democracy, whereas the Mongkok protests are driven by livelihood issues to much extent, and democracy is seen as a way of addressing those livelihood issues. So if the Hong Kong government was more willing to tackle some of those livelihood issues, and they could take the sting out of this to a certain extent. I agree that for as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power, Hong Kong will not have genuine democracy. The two things are incompatible. But I think that Beijing also needs to find a way out of the current problem it has in Hong Kong, which is it's not yet had a chief executive who can rule effectively. So Beijing is still looking for a way to have a more effective leader. Tung Chee-hwa was ineffectual and fairly useless. They tried a very different person, untrusted, in Donald Tsang. He was, after all, Sir Donald Tsang. And then when that didn't work, they went with CY they knew they could trust him. But even his strong sort of authoritarian streak has not resolved this problem. So they're going to be looking around, well, if they are looking around for how can we find some leader who has enough legitimacy to be accepted by the Hong Kong people and to run the government effectively, whilst at the same time we can control him. I think that that's a paradox, but if the protesters can show to the Hong Kong government and to the central government that a more democratic, whilst never wholly democratic, but a more democratic system, one where the leader does address livelihood issues rather than just kowtow to tycoons, then some of this ineffectual government can be resolved. So there is still a little room for negotiation, but obviously the students' demands for civic nomination is never going to be passed by Beijing. But Beijing are savvy operators. I'm sure that they will be negotiating something, or at least thinking of some solution. Whether they come up with the right solution or we'll see. We won't know until they've offered it. But I'm sure that there is still room for manoeuvre.
Well, I think we've got to call it to an end. Thank you very much, Matthew, for joining us from there. First of all, for this fascinating movie, I must say, and to Ping for joining us right here. So we normally actually offer you a tie. I guess we'll send it by mail, or you'll get it next time you come to talk to us about your next project. So thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight, and see you soon at the next FCC event. Good night.